I've had enough. GDP. It's got to go. I think as a functional measurement of life satisfaction or quality of life or anything else, it's functionally useless, and its generative being was caused by the idea that economics was a one-to-one correlation with life progress, journey, satisfaction, success. This is obviously very Anglo, and particularly Anglo in the neoliberalism, free market style mentality, philosophy. But for me, I think it's time that we hang its boots up, because when you consider chrematistics and the study of like how economics interplays with reality and like lived reality, you fail to understand its purpose at all almost. The idea that GDP can be measured, I think, is one thing, and I'm not sure it's fair to say that it's accurate anyhow. And if you look at some of the basic mathematics around GDP, and obviously the economic models used by the World Bank and others are much more complex, but the general consensus is that we're measuring what can be measured, not measuring total productivity or total economic produce of a country. This already being a failed, incomplete system makes it, to me, just guesswork to a large degree, and how you're letting guesswork inform policy decisions which impact everybody in myriad of ways, particularly negative ways. This is what we'll draw back to in terms of how workers are treated as economic input and variables. Just one goes into the little slots of, I can use an economic agent here and here and here, and they're all interchangeable because they're all nameless, faceless, grey little minions. Which, I mean, they are great little minions, but they're not economic in that way. Is making it virtually useless for us as a measurement, as a metric. So what I would say is we are looking at this post-GDP world. There has been some work here, and this is by mostly ideologues in the economic space, where they go, look, we also recognize that GDP has had its time in the sun. Maybe it's time to sundown GDP as a concept. How do we go past this? Because as economists, we need to measure something, otherwise we'll have a stroke. And so they try to come up with alternatives and solutions, rather than saying, look, our profession is a joke. We're basically employing ourselves with the advisor hat that we managed to weasel out of what was previously a senior courtier, who would probably advise on commercial matters, and commercial thus not necessarily one-to-one with economics, because economics is maybe a downstream of commerce in general. We can think of economics as principles, and I think there are some useful, this is maybe in the Austrian school more so than the classical or neoclassical economics, is that there are principles of economics that will hold true forever, supply and demand, money supply, things like this. But in general, the measurement of this is nonsensical in the GDP way. It's our best attempt at something which I don't necessarily think needed to be attempted. We can measure trade. It doesn't have to be required that we also measure wage and other factors, and particularly when it comes to inflation. The idea that we've now tied money as a concept into goods and trade is relatively new. We historically have not done that. The Roman Empire did do that as well, and obviously ran into a myriad of their plethora of their own issues, because it can become a bit of a headache or a shambles when you consider the money management side and aspect. Luckily, we technologized our way out of that. The Faustian man, being the creative problem solver to infinity that he is, can go, no, look, I'm going to digitalize, which means I can account for much more accurately this version of the economic cycle. And that's particularly stems out of what we think is Norman, Anglo-Norman additions to the economic side of life, which is much more around accounting and precision, and making sure that there's a correspondent calculation and tabulation done with an exchange of goods, and with how we measure and mark things. This is, as I said, very Anglo-Norman. So there are some positives to it. And I think interactivity on the micro scale in economics still holds very true. There's a lot to be said of the value there, but the macroeconomics is basically worthless. You have a bunch of tosspot eggheads meandering about, bumping into each other, saying random shit that no one cares about. The only other people that care are either economists, and then media, who have to quote somebody on something by virtue of meritocratic, well, I say credentialism probably is a better way to say it. On credentialism alone is to say, oh, look, this PhD in economics is telling us the GDP is not going so good. Oh my God. I mean, who cares? Really? Look outside. If your life feels like it's starting to suck, there's probably not even a relationship to the GDP there. There's no correlation at all. And I can delve into why that feels like that, but it was just to say that economists have started to think and suggest things like this, but in their fanciful, halcyon ways. They come up with nonsense, Thomas More utopia style bullshit, where it's, what if we thought more about how the happiness of a society is, who cares about this stuff? Like, if you looked at historical economics from that way, first of all, no one really cares about historical. I mean, no one is looking at the high cultures and going, I care specifically about the GDP calculation of the Magian Arabia, or in China, or in India, or in Malaysia. These are not things that anyone cares about at all. They are just considerations of the reflection of what do we think the life was like back then, and that's just a material versus spiritual side of things. But who cares about the actual GDP? Oh, and let me just calculate what inflation was in ancient China in 233 AD. It's like, no one cares about this shit. It's so stupid. But that's where we are. We're saying, no, we actually do care about today, because I need to make decisions tomorrow based on the realities. But the realities of today, they're farcical, they're spooks, they're phantasms. They don't exist. They only exist because you tell them they exist. We've calculated it and it's worth this much. But is it? Can you tell me that? And like the components for certain goods? Have you ever worked in a company that sets prices? Other than the material input prices, they just make it up. Software, you just price it however you want. This is where we are in a fantasy land of an economy. So when you look at these charts of like, here's the GDP of the United States, it's like 21 billion, it may as well be 50, it may as well be 100. You just make that number up. What's stopping anybody saying, no, actually my productivity this year was $50,000 million worth of output. You can't measure it because it's some incalculable version of my application of secondhand goods or volunteering work. Oh, and now we can calculate, now it's 100 billion, so 100 trillion. Just make it up, who cares? What are you going to justify? It doesn't change reality, so what's the point? And that's my consideration here is, you look at GDP growth, real GDP growth here in the EU and the Nordics, it's dog shit. It's below 6%. So you're measuring something that doesn't change virtually materially year to year. So in like 20 years, you're 50% better off. But are you? Are you really? No. Your clothes are the same. Your house is the same. You have a few extra technological goods. Is your life better, measurably better from having what is it supposed to be? More money? You go on more holidays, do you? A nicer car? But a car, we're always going to get nicer. That's what technology is about. That's why China floods the market with cheap but much better cars than 15 years ago. And they're electric. It's like, all of this stuff is technology solved. And this goes doubly so for productivity. So you can see some of these measures that economists do around productivity, and the technological landscape here is such that it's not linear, but it's progressing linearly, which is to say, as a collective whole, we are progressing technologically speaking every year. We're finding better ways to do certain things such that, and I've spoken this at length already, but better, faster, more efficient, and more often, this is how we start to think about the problem-solving aspect of technology in our lives. The Faustian soul needs to be infinitely problem-solving on the technological basis. This is the techniques of living. So productivity will always go up. And you say, oh, well, we introduce AI and it will get rid of all these jobs. No. Any introduction of any technology is just going to increase the amount of required work. More people doing more things for more of the time. There is no extra leisure. There is no extra benefit to this other than more productivity. Fine. I actually like productivity. That's good. But the relationship to wage is completely divergent. So you have a huge chasm now between how much you're productive-wise contributing and then how much you're actually reflectively paid. We go, no, but the GDP reflects this. It was like, well, there is no correlation now to your productivity level and the GDP, other than if your employer gives you a certain raise around what inflation was, and inflation is dictated by other things, certainly without of your realm of responsibility and effects. So what are you really doing? Nothing. You're just turning up somewhere, helping some other guy get rich, and then going home. If you're an entrepreneur, then you're basically forming a tiny little cog in this gigantic cheese wheel, and then that's how the world turns around. But these are not ways of living. This is just a way to do commerce. Commerce will never have a moratorium just because we get rid of the concept of GDP. And this is why chrematistics is so important on this realm, because it's say, like, look, economics can no longer be the be-all and end-all of measurement around life feeling, but also success as a society, as a culture. This winter of the Faustian man has to be more than that. It has to be more than an analytical number that we've conjured out of neoliberalism. It's just not working. It's not functional for me to have to care about this anymore. And I also advocate for you to just be like, no, you tell me the GDP goes up and down, I don't care. It really does not bother me. You see a news article, you see someone on YouTube, you see someone on TV talking about GDP going up and down, you mute, you turn it off, because they're retarded. They are functionally not understanding the ideation of GDP as a concept, or why did we conjure it and what was it supposed to be doing, versus now I'm using it as a stick to beat you over the head with information that I feel as if is important because I have nothing else to talk about. So I know this will impact the GDP. Who gives it? Who gives a shit? Really? Do you care? No. GDP goes down 2%, we're in a recession. Okay. 2 years later, we're not in a recession anymore. Okay. And in which part of this time my life has gone from terrible to less terrible. And these are artificial concepts around how we pull levers of money supply and money generation, like product. So we're trying to inflate and then deflate a bubble with artifice. And this is how the entire economic system works. We think governments can have the power on this. But this is getting away from the meritocratic affair of what was originally the Anglo-Norman spirit of you can make life what you make out of it, and you can measure it in money. And money is a very, very important concept. I don't want to do away with money, and I like the idea of quantifying an amount of commercial activity. I don't like GDP. It's like some communist hellscape created out of the minds of the antediluvian enemy of this people. It's like, how do I conjure something that's so horrible to have and oppressive as a concept in the communist nightmare? And here it is. Here's your GDP. And you say, like, Karl Marx would hate of GDP, but do you think he would have created GDP just to burn everyone else with it? The guy was full of hate. He would have done this. This is something he would like. If I can measure GDP, then I can divide it by the number of citizens that there are, and everyone gets a part of that GDP, because that's how it works. In my very German English retarded brain, whatever he was. So I mean, that's the nature of it for me, at least. The reasoning why GDP as a concept has failed is that it no longer has meaning to me. I no longer consider it worthy of my time, of my efforts, of my considerations. If you tell me the GDP growth forecast for the next 5 years is X, I have no energy in it. There's no capacity in my brain to fathom that. It is a meaningless term. First of all, because your forecasts are dog shit, and that goes into how economists proclaim to have their super forecasting capabilities, the triangulation of certain variables into the way that we start to think about growth or in sometimes decline. It's like, oh no, but these pressures, and who cares? First of all, get a real job. Being an economist is not a real job. I was an economist. It's not a real job. You can be a problem solver, but you can apply problems and solve problems in a very much more productive way, particularly when it comes to technology or into engineering or invention or even just basic commerce, like go and work in a business. You're adding much more value to everyone's life by not being an economist. Secondly, I think it's the case that most of the institutions which use GDP do not have your best interests at heart. The World Bank, the WEF, NATO, the UN, all of these are very hardcore GDP acolytes. It's to them an infrangible concept that they must have and hold true, otherwise their basis of authority crumbles to a large degree. How do I consistently remind people that GDP is important and to keep working and to make sure that they're productive for everyone's prosperity, while I can just hammer into them how important this type of growth is? But this is all backwards. Correspondent growth is from technological improvements. That's it. And traditionally, we made technology. The man of technology did it to solve the problem. He got the ego boost, and he got the Faustian call to nature here, a sort of impetus, like this internal longing to solve these problems. And when you do that, when you conquer it and you vanquish what is the foe, you've climbed, I'm using a lot of metaphors, you climbed the mountain, you are at the pinnacle, and you've reached the zenith here, and you can feel good. The commercial side of this, or the economics of invention, is completely separating what was a tradition, a soulful tradition of improvement, particularly embodied by the Americans, into something where it's just, it's a cash grab. So how can I grab cash the fastest? And that's why you have third worlders imported into H-1B visas and go, how many lines of code can I churn out every day so that you can earn $1 more? This is not invention. This is complete artifice. It's the mechanization. It's machine style application. So this is how the fellaheen do things. It's like, we can take a concept and we can just apply it quite literally with no concept of the soul behind it, the reasoning. It's just the Chinese room of invention. Let's make it this because this is how the white man has done it. Let's do it like this. So now we're in an arms race against the third world, basically, in around conjuring up new and interesting technologies. And they'll always be behind because they have no soul for invention. They don't understand the drive for it. If you left them out in the paddy fields with all the food and wants and wills that they could ever have, they wouldn't invent these things. But they're being driven to because they see the competition effect of, well, if I do this, then I can be better off. But that's also an Anglo-Faustian pull. We've imbued them with our own complex. But we have the solution to our complex where they never do. They don't get the same and don't derive the same feelings of success out of these conquer and vanquishings that we do. So this is why, and this does relate to GDP because this is how we're all calculating this stuff. It's the after effect. And this is why you can do away with it. It's by all reasoning and logic meaningless to us from this day on and forever.